Welcome to the first installment of Black Cat Theology, a series of lectures devoted to themes in philosophical theology. In particular, in this series of lectures, we will be discussing what relation, if any, is there between the later philosophy of Martin Heidegger, the renowned German philosopher, and contemporary theology, especially contemporary theology that characterizes itself as non-metaphysical. Now, what I want to do in this first lecture is introduce myself, give some of my own background, and explain what first drew me to the writings of Heidegger, his later writings in particular. My name is Peter Dillard. I received my Bachelor of Arts in Philosophy from the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. I then went on to study philosophy in graduate school, to do my graduate studies at the University of Pennsylvania, and I received my PhD from that institution in 1994. I started out specializing in analytic philosophy. I wrote a dissertation on analytic philosophy of language, and I originally pursued philosophy in that tradition. But even as an undergraduate, I had read extensively in the phenomenological and existentialist traditions, and I had even considered becoming a continental philosopher at that time. But for various reasons that we don't need to get into here today, I eventually decided to start out, at least initially, as an analytic philosopher. But what was it that attracted me to Heidegger, and when did I first encounter it? The first time that I read anything by Heidegger was in a seminar I attended in my freshman year of college. And the text for that seminar were the essays in the collection Poetry, Language, and Thought. Now, this was exactly the wrong way to approach Heidegger. This is not the first thing by Heidegger that I or anybody else should read. Ideally, one should start with his most famous text, Being and Time, and then after that turn to the later writings and see how the earlier philosophy develops into the later philosophy. So I did it completely backwards. And in all honesty, I really did not understand what was going on in any of those essays. The language was very dense. It was not lucid. I didn't understand it. Nevertheless, there was something in that language that I found very interesting. It was fascinating, and it was quite evocative. I had never seen anybody use language in that way before, and I found it very compelling in a way that I didn't really understand. Why did that happen? And it's taken me a long time to understand that. I think that I have a better understanding now. Heidegger grew up in southwestern rural Germany, and I was born and raised in southeastern rural Tennessee, in the southeastern rural United States. Now, there are many cultural differences, to be sure, between rural southwestern Germany and the rural southeastern United States, but there are also very powerful similarities. Especially, in both places you have a very rural and agrarian culture. In both places you have a very religious culture. Religion is not simply something that you go to church and see on Sunday, but it's part of the landscape, it's part of the air you breathe. Those issues are taken very, very seriously in both of those cultures. It's almost part of the atmosphere. And in both of those places, there is a hostility to the values of modernity, especially at the time I was growing up, and certainly when Heidegger was. There's a kind of suspicion about the urban. There's a suspicion about technology. There's a romanticizing of this sort of bucolic rural existence. And so I think because of those similarities, I could relate to some of the things that Heidegger was saying, because a lot of his language in those essays evokes the forest, evokes the mountains, evokes the sky and nature and the rural lifestyle, which he romanticized, and so did I to a certain extent as a child and a young man growing up in Tennessee. Now, I certainly no longer agree with a lot of the political positions that are quite prevalent in the southeastern United States. And I certainly have a lot of problems, as we'll be discussing later in the lecture series, with Heidegger's own political commitments, in particular his commitment to National Socialism. But even though I don't have those political sympathies, I certainly can understand how the culture that I grew up in shaped me and maybe predisposed me to be receptive to Heidegger's later writings. So having introduced myself now, let me also mention that the lectures that I will be presenting here are based on my book that has just been published by Palgrave Macmillan. It's called Non-Metaphysical Theology After Heidegger. It's by Peter S. Dillard, yours truly. And so the material that I will be presenting in these lectures draws upon that book, and you can find it on Amazon.com and BarnesandNoble.com and also on the Palgrave Macmillan website and other various booksellers. So I will be drawing upon that. With that in mind, let me now present in very general terms the problem space that will be occupying us in these lectures. Perhaps a good place to begin is with a meeting in October of 1960 in Bethel by Bielefeld in Germany. This was a meeting of the old Marburgers, a circle of the theologian Rudolf Bultmann's former pupils. And so they would meet once in a year and sort of discuss current philosophical and theological trends. And it so happened that in this year, 1960, there was a young Swiss theologian named Heinrich Ott who was quite interested in Heidegger and wanted to establish what he saw as he wanted to show what he believed to be a correspondence between Heidegger's later thinking and the contemporary theology of his day, in particular the theology of Karl Barth, who was one of Ott's teachers, but not just Barth, the sort of contemporary theology of his day. And so what's interesting here is the idea that when Heidegger is talking about being in his later writings, and also some other notions like the holy, which I'm going to say a little bit more about in a minute, but when he's talking about being and the holy, God, the last gods, and things like that, there's a kind of structural correspondence, Ott claims, between that discourse and what's going on in the theology of his day, which is faith, reflecting upon itself as a kind of theology that is discussing divinity. So to put it somewhat crudely, in the way that Ott is thinking, what Heidegger says about being sort of stands in a very similar relation to what Barth and other contemporary theologians of Ott's day are saying about divinity. Now, what strikes me about this claim is that it's premature. Whether there's a correspondence or not between later Heidegger's thinking and contemporary theology, whether there is a correspondence or not can't really be answered unless we can first of all determine that there is a coherent body of thinking in later Heidegger. If we don't have a coherent body of thinking about being and the holy and the God and the last God in Heidegger's later thinking, if we don't have that, if there isn't such a coherent body of thought, then obviously there's no correspondence between that, which is nothing coherent, and what's going on, whatever it is, in contemporary theology. And so we have to be very careful, and before we can answer Ott's question, we need to look at Heidegger's later thinking. And in particular, these discussions that you find in later Heidegger, not only of being, the event of being, understood non-metaphysically, but what one might call the discourse of the holy. This is when Heidegger is talking about God, the Godhead sometimes, but more frequently about the holy, the gods. Sometimes he discusses gods in the plural as a plurality, divinity, and the last God. These things, this discourse of the holy, what does it mean? And how does it relate to what Heidegger says about being non-metaphysically understood? If we can't get clear about that, if it's just all a bunch of gobbledygook, then there's no need to investigate whether there is any fruitful correspondence between the discourse of the holy and being, all that stuff that Heidegger talks about, and contemporary theology. And the problem is that when we look at Heidegger's statements from various times in his later career, we see things that don't really cohere. They contradict each other, and at least give us prima facie some reason to think that, well, maybe it really isn't coherent. So what I want to do is be very honest about that and just read for you a few passages. And what I have in mind here in particular is exactly what relation does Heidegger see among being, beings, and the holy, or God, the holy, the last God. Let's just say the holy. Now sometimes Heidegger says things like this: being, that is not God and not a cosmic ground. Being is farther than all beings and yet is nearer to man than every being, be it a rock, a beast, a work of art, a machine, be it an angel or God. Being is the nearest, yet the near remains farthest from man. Now notice here that when Heidegger is talking about being and then these other things, beings like a rock, a beast, a work of art, a machine, an angel, or a God, he lists God alongside these other beings. And then by the way, I believe this passage comes from the letter on humanism. So here it makes it sound like Heidegger thinks, well, God is a particular being. And he's not the same as being, which is what is common to all beings, but God is a particular being. All right? And presumably God is the holy. So here it would sound like God, which is the highest holy thing, is a being. But then at other times, he says things that suggest a very different position. In this passage, I'm drawing upon his lecture on Friedrich Hölderlin's very famous poem, The Ister. So here's what Heidegger says there. And remember, we're trying to track the relation between the holy or God, being as a general characteristic or feature of all beings, and a being or these beings. So here's what Heidegger says in the Hölderlin lecture. The gods are without feeling of themselves. That is, remaining with their own essence, they are never able to comport themselves toward beings. For this, a relation to being is required, i.e. to the holy, that is beyond them, that is beyond beings. Being as shown to them through the other who is the sign, namely the poet. Now notice here that Heidegger is equating being as the characteristic or the horizon, if you will, on which all beings show up or which all beings have in common or through which they show up. He's equating that with the holy, with God. So here God is not a being. God himself, the holy, is being. So that's a very different position from what we had in the other passage that I read. Thirdly, yet another relationship is suggested in a passage from Heidegger's Contributions to Philosophy, which is a kind of philosophical diary that he kept in the 30s. So here's what he says there. He declares emphatically, the God is neither a being nor a non-being, and it is also not identified with being, where this is Heidegger's term for being understood non-metaphysically. But again, what all beings have in common, which is a bit too metaphysical, but the horizon which enables all beings to show up. So notice that he also says this, for being is never a determination of the God as God, rather being is that which the divinization of the God needs so as to remain nevertheless completely distinct from it. So here, the holy or God is said to be neither a being nor a being, it's neither a being nor being itself. It's something different. So in these various passages, we have three very different relationships described among the holy, being as this sort of general characteristic that beings share, which is a tendentious way of putting it, but I'm going to let that stand for now, and particular beings, right? So the point that we might want to draw now, if we were to stop here, would be, well, Heidegger is contradicting himself. He doesn't set forth any coherent or stable understanding of what the relationship is between the holy or God, being, and beings. He contradicts himself, and so maybe there isn't any coherent body of thought here in Heidegger's later philosophy. If that is so, then Ott is incorrect to claim that there's any kind of fruitful correspondence between Heidegger's later thinking of being, the gods, and the holy and beings, on the one hand, and contemporary theology on the other, whether that's the theology of Karl Barth or contemporary Catholic or Protestant theology or whatever it is, because it looks like Heidegger is not saying anything coherent. Now, I think that that's mistaken. I think that there is a lot more going on there, and just to anticipate a little bit, I think that what we have in Heidegger here is not so much gobbledygook or contradiction, but we have, in fact, three very, very different, what I want to call proto-theologies that Heidegger suggests. Three very, very different sort of schematic ways of thinking about the relation between the holy or among the holy being and beings. And next, in my next lecture, what I would like to do is to describe these different proto-theologies, look at some of their strengths and weaknesses, and maybe make a provisional decision in favor of one of them as a stepping stone to the next series of considerations that we will make about Heidegger and theology. So that's all for today. Thank you for joining me. I hope you will find these lectures interesting, and have a good day. And until next time, that's all for Black Cat Theology. Thank you.